Her brother offered her 60 pounds to disappear. She pushed the money back across the desk without touching a single coin. So they gave her the thing they were certain was worthless, a deed to a rotting castle on a cliff, a ruin so far gone the villagers wouldn't walk past it after dark. They laughed when she took it. They laughed harder when she carried out the lame dog they'd already ordered shot. What none of them knew was that the sealed tower on that headland held something older than their family name, and the paper they just handed her was already a lie. If you enjoy stories about quiet people who refuse to stay quiet, take a second to subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. This one earns it. And leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The offer was made in a room that smelled of sealing wax and old smoke. 6 weeks after they put her father in the ground. Beatrice Kello sat with her gloves in her lap and her hands folded on top of them because she had learned young that hands tell people things you'd rather they didn't know. Across the desk, the solicitor, Mr. Pike, read from a letter he had not written in a voice he was trying to keep flat and failing. 60 pounds. That was the number. 60 pounds in exchange for which she would renounce every present and future claim upon the Kello name. The Kello lands, the Kello trust. And this was the phrase that stuck in her like a splinter: remove her person from the county of Galloway at her earliest convenience. Her brother had not come. That was the part that landed hardest, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. Rupert could have said it to her face in 10 seconds. Instead, he had paid a man to say it slowly on paper with a stamp on it. There was a cruelty in that which no shouting could match. Shouting at least required you to be in the room. Your brother is not obliged to offer you anything at all, Pike said when she had let the silence run too long for his comfort. I want you to understand that, Miss Kello. The trust is entailed. Legally, you are, forgive me, you are a guest in that house and have been since the day your father died. I understand the law, Boss said. Then you understand this is generous. She looked at the letter. Her father had been in the ground 6 weeks. His study still smelled of him. Honoria had already begun changing the curtains. It isn't generous, she said. It's a price. 60 pounds is what my brother thinks it costs to make me stop existing. And if I take it, I've agreed with him. Pike set the letter down. He was a decent enough man in a trade that rarely rewarded it, and for a moment he looked genuinely tired. Miss Kello, where will you go? I don't know yet. That is not an answer that will keep you warm in December. No, she agreed, but it's mine. She pushed the letter back across the desk. She did it slowly because she wanted to be certain she meant it, and because some part of her, a small, cold, sensible part, was screaming. 60 pounds was a year of lodging. 60 pounds was a winter coat and a train fare and time to think. She had 9 shillings and 4 pence in her purse, and no position, no husband, no living parent, and no reference from the household she had run for 4 years without wages, because you do not draw wages for keeping your own father's accounts. She pushed it back anyway. And that was the moment she thought about it often later, standing in the wind on a cliff with her hands split open from lime. That was the moment everything else became possible. Not because refusing was brave, because refusing left them with a problem. They had expected her to take the money and go. When she didn't, they had to give her something else. They gave her a ruin. Bam! The second document came out of a leather case, and it did not come from Pike. The man who produced it had been sitting against the wall the entire time, so still and so gray that B had taken him for a clerk. He wasn't. He was Silas Threlfall, factor to the Ravensmuir estate, and he had the particular stillness of a man who has spent 30 years in rooms where other people's futures were being decided, and had learned that the safest place to stand is just out of the light. There is an alternative, Threlfall said. His Grace is minded to be charitable in the circumstances. There is a property on the Kirkhaven coast. Corby Craig. It has been unoccupied for some 60 years. Unoccupied, B repeated. A ruin, Pike said bluntly. Let us not dress it. Miss Kello, it is a tower and a broken wall on a headland. The roof of the hall is gone. It has no tenants, no rent roll, no road, and no value. The estate has been trying to be rid of it for 2 generations. It is a liability with a view. And the debt, B asked. Threlfall's eyes moved to her then, just slightly. Your late father owed His Grace a courtesy, not a sum. His Grace considers the conveyance a full and final discharge. The keep passes to you, the courtesy is forgotten, and everyone concerned may consider the matter closed. Everyone concerned, she turned the phrase over. It was a beautiful piece of construction, that phrase. It included her brother, who wanted her gone. It included a duke who wanted a millstone off his books. It included Threlfall himself, who wanted whatever men like Threlfall always want, which is for nobody to look too closely at anything. It did not include her. She was not a concerned party. She was the thing being disposed of. "May I see the instrument?" she said. Pike slid it across. Threlfall's hand twitched. She saw it, a half-inch of movement arrested, and she thought interesting. She read it carefully because Enid Sowerby had taught her to read everything carefully, and because a woman with 9 shillings cannot afford to sign anything she has not understood. It was a deed of gift properly worded, granting Corby Craig Keep and its policies to Beatrice Ann Kello, her heirs and assignees absolutely. And at the foot of it, the date was written in a different ink than the body. Not dramatically, not so a careless eye would catch it. The body was brown-black and slightly faded the way ink goes when it has sat a week in a hot room. The date was blacker, wetter, sharper at the edges. The document had been drawn up some time ago and dated this morning. Bee's thumb rested on the line for perhaps 2 seconds. She said nothing. Later she would be asked why she said nothing, asked in a courtroom under oath by a man in a wig who wanted very much for her answer to be, because she was already planning something. And the honest answer, the one she gave, was this: because she was 25 years old and homeless and had just refused 60 pounds, and because a woman in that position who starts questioning documents in front of 2 solicitors is a woman who walks out with nothing at all. So she filed it away. That was all. She noticed a thing about a piece of paper, and she put it somewhere in her mind, and she closed the drawer on it, and she went on to the next disaster, which was arriving in the room at that exact moment in the form of her brother's man. "I'll take it," she said. "Where do I sign, Miss Kello?" Pike began. "Where do I sign, Mr. Pike?" Threlfall notarized it himself. He drew out his seal and pressed it and blotted it and slid it back to her, and he did it with the smooth economy of a man who had done it 1,000 times. She would think about that seal, too. Not for months, but she would think about it. Rupert's groom was waiting in the passage with his hat in his hands and a face like a man sent to drown kittens. "Miss B," he said. "Miss, about the dog." Her stomach dropped before he finished the sentence. "What about the dog?" "Mr. Kello says—" He stopped. Started again. "He says the beast can't hunt with that leg, and it's no use to a household, and there's mouths enough. He's told Dowdy to see to it Thursday. I thought you'd want knowing." Bracken was 6 years old, gray as a Wintersea 3/4 deerhound, and the rest of him unaccounted for. He had come off a man-trap in Caldame Wood 2 winters back with his off hind leg ruined, and Bee's father had sat up with him 4 nights running on the study floor with a bottle of carbolic and a lamp. Her father, who could not be bothered to check his own rent books. Her father, who had been useless in almost every way a man can be useless, and who had sat on a cold floor for 4 nights because the dog was frightened of the dark. "He's not Rupert's dog," Bee said. "He's in the house, miss. Everything in the house is—" "I know what everything in the house is." She was aware distantly that she had raised her voice for the first time in 6 weeks. Pike hummed to the doorway. Threlfall had not, which somehow was worse. She walked back to Kello House, 4 miles in the rain, because there was no cart, and she went in by the yard door because she was not going to give Honoria the pleasure of the front hall, and she found Bracken chained by the tack room with his ears flat and his ribs going like a bellows because he had heard the word Thursday too in the way animals hear words, not the sound of it, but the weight. She unclipped him. Honoria found her in the yard. Honoria was 28 and handsome in the way of expensive furniture, and she had the particular gift of saying vicious things in a tone of mild concern, so that if you objected, you looked hysterical. "Beatrice, you're soaked through. Rupert said you'd been offered very fair terms." "I refused them." "Oh." A pause, beautifully judged. "Well, that's your choice, of course. Though I do think a woman alone ought to consider the dog can't go with you. Dear, be sensible. Where would you even keep it?" Bee stood in the rain with her hand in the wet fur of the dog's neck, and she felt something happen in her chest that she would not have been able to name at the time. It was not rage. Rage would have been simpler, and it would have burned out on the road. It was arithmetic. "They are counting," she thought. 60 pounds for me, nothing for him. They have put a number on every single thing in this house, and I am on the list, and so is he. And the reason it hurts is not that the number is low. It's that they were allowed to write it at all. His name is Bracken, she said. He's coming with me. To where exactly Corby Craig? Honoria laughed. She did not mean to be cruel with it. That was the thing Bea remembered. She genuinely laughed the way you laugh when a child says something absurd. The Corby Beatrice, there's no roof. Then I'll want a hammer, Bea said, and I'll be taking father's since he left it in the stable. And nobody in this house has ever known what it was for. She carried the dog out through the gate herself, all 4 stone of him, because his leg would not take the yard cobbles at speed, and she was not going to be seen dragging him. Her arms shook by the road. She did not put him down until the house was out of sight. Tam Rory ran the carrier's cart up the coast twice a week and had opinions about most things which he shared with his horse. He took her trunk without comment, looked at the toy, looked at her boots and said, "6 pence to Kirkhaven and I'll no charge for the beast." They went north for 2 days. She spent 4 pence of her 9 shillings on a bed and a bowl of broth at Auchenford and gave half the broth to Bracken under the table and lay awake most of the night doing sums that would not come out no matter which way she arranged them. On the second afternoon, Tam spoke without turning round. "You'll be the lassie that's got the Corby. News travels. It's a wee coast," he clicked at the horse. "I'll say this once, and then I'll no say it again, for it's none of my business. There's men in Kirkhaven who'll no take work up on you in Headland for double money. No because of ghosts. I dinna hold wi' ghosts." Then why? He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd finished. "Because the last folk that had anything to do with Ravensmere paper," Tam said, "are no in Kirkhaven anymore." He would not say another word about it, not that day. But she noticed when they came down into the village that people stopped what they were doing to watch the cart, and then one by one as it became clear who was on it, they found something else to look at. A net, a rope, their own hands. Not one of them met her eye. It was not hostility. Hostility she could have worked with. It was something quieter and far more dangerous, and it took her 3 months to find the name for it. They were embarrassed. The track up to the headland was a mile of mud and stone, and it took her an hour and 40 minutes with the trunk resting every 100 yards because Bracken could not go faster, and she would not go on without him. And then she saw it. Corby Craig was not a romantic ruin. It was a carcass. A broken jaw of curtain wall, a gatehouse reduced to 2 stumps, a great hall standing open to the sky with grass growing out of the floor. 60 years of gulls. 60 years of weather. It looked less like a building than like something the sea had chewed and spat back onto the land. And at the seaward end, black against a white sky, the tower. It was the only part of the whole place that had not surrendered. Round squat built of a stone darker than everything around it. Its courses fitted so tight that after 6 decades of unrepaired abandonment, there was not one gap she could put a finger in. Everything else had fallen down. The tower had simply stood there and let the century happen. She went to the base to find the door. There was no door. There was a doorway. She could see the arch of it, the springing of the jambs, and the entire opening from threshold to keystone was packed solid with stone. Not fallen stone. She knew fallen stone. She'd been raised on a farm that was quietly collapsing. Fallen stone is chaos. This was coursed, level bed staggered joints, the whole face mortared with something hard and gray that had not weathered back the way the old lime had. Somebody had walled that tower shut, deliberately, from the outside, and then had left. Bea stood in the wind with her hand flat on it for a long moment. "Well," she said to the dog who was the only one there, "somebody didn't want that opened." She found her shelter in what had been a pantry off the kitchen range. A stone box no bigger than a wardrobe with 4 walls that stood a floor of hard-packed earth, and the thing that decided it, a ceiling of overlapping flag slabs rather than slate, laid by some long-dead mason who had understood exactly what the wind off the North Channel does to a roof. She cleared it out in 5 hours. She had 1 candle. The first night the gale came round from the northeast and got into the ruin, and made a noise she was entirely unprepared for. Not howling, but a low tonal moaning where the wind crossed the broken chimney, flues rising and falling like something very large, breathing badly in the next room. Bracken pressed himself into her spine and shook. She lay with her arm over him and her eyes open and did the only thing she could think to do, which was to say out loud into the dark the thing Enid Sowerby had said to her for 20 years. "Stone remembers last. Paper remembers longer. Keep both." Enid had said it about ledgers mostly, about the household accounts, about writing down the price of everything you bought and everything you sold, because a woman who cannot prove what she paid can be told anything. She had said it the day Bee's mother died, and again the day Bee turned 16, and Rupert came home from Edinburgh with his new voice, and again on the doorstep 6 weeks ago, holding both Bee's hands before the coach. Bee had thought it was about thrift. It was going to take her most of a year to understand that it was a warning. Um, Morning brought the practical horror of it, which was worse than the wind. She had 9 shillings less sixpence for the cart, less fourpence for the bed, less a penny for a candle. She had a trunk of clothes suited to a house with fires in it. She had no fuel, no lamp, no bedding beyond what she'd traveled in, no food beyond a heel of bread, and no earthly notion how to get any of it, because the money that would have bought all of it was sitting on a solicitor's desk in Balcarron with her brother's name on the letter. And she had a dog who needed feeding more than she did because he'd walked a mile of headland track on 3.5 legs and would do it again tomorrow if she asked him. She went down to the village. Mrs. Vint's shop sold flour, salt, tea, tallow, rope, and gossip in roughly that order of profitability. Bee went in with her list written out and her chin up and asked in the flattest voice she could manage for a month's credit. Mrs. Vint looked at the list. Mrs. Vint looked at her. Mrs. Vint looked very deliberately at the window. I dinna give credit. You gave credit to the man ahead of me. I heard you. That's Wool Tarrant. I've kent him 40 year. Then take my name and my address and my word, and I'll pay you at the month's end. And where would ye be paying me from hen? It was not said unkindly. That was the thing that took the legs out from under her. There was even a sort of pity in it. Mrs. Vint was a woman of about 60 with red hands and a tired mouth, and she was not enjoying this at all, and she was doing it anyway. I'm asking you for a sack of oatmeal, Bee said, not for charity, for credit, at interest if you like. And Mrs. Vint leaned forward over the counter and said the sentence that Bee would still be able to repeat word for word 2 years in one courtroom later. Lassie, it's no about your money. The Corbys no ours to help. What does that mean? It means what it means. It means there's things on this coast that folk have learned no to touch, and yon headland's the biggest of them. She straightened. Her hands were flat on the counter, and they were not quite steady. Away hame, whichever hame you've got. I haven't got one, Bee said. That's rather the point. She walked out with nothing. She got 20 yards up the street before she had to stop and put her hand on a wall because her vision had gone strange at the edges, and she understood with total clarity that she was going to be hungry tonight, and hungrier tomorrow, and that there was no bottom to this, no floor she would eventually land on. There was just further down. And then a woman with a scarred face crossed the street towards her, carrying a bundle in a cloth, and shoved it into her hands without stopping, and kept walking. Bee got out 3 words. Wait, who dinna thank me in the street, the woman said without turning round. Effie Gillen, and I never gave ye a thing. It was half a loaf, a knuckle of salt bacon, and a twist of oatmeal and newspaper. Bee stood in the middle of Kirkhaven, holding a stranger's food, and understood 2 things simultaneously, and the second one frightened her much more than the first. The first was that somebody in this village was willing to help her. The second was that they were only willing to do it where nobody could see. The days after that ran together into a single long ache. She learned the well in the north corner of the courtyard, and the 81 steps down the cliff path, to the cove where the driftwood came in, and that seaweed burns hot and stinks, and that you can boil oatmeal in water and eat it 3 times a day for 11 days before you begin to think about it in ways that are not entirely rational. She learned her own hands. They came apart within a fortnight, the palms first, then the knuckles, then a split at the base of the right thumb, that opened every morning and closed every night and would not heal until March. She learned to bind them with strips off her second-best petticoat, which was a garment that had no other purpose in her life now and never would again. She cleared. That was all she did. She could not build. She had no money and no materials and no skill. But she could shift what had fallen and stack it where it could be found, and Enid had taught her on the crumbling farm of her childhood that this is not nothing. A tidy ruin is a building waiting. An untidy one is a quarry. She sorted stone by size along the north wall. She sorted timber by soundness, the sound the doubtful, the fit only for burning, and the burning pile kept her alive through October. And every single day she looked at the tower. It became a kind of hunger separate from the actual hunger. She walked the outside of it so many times she could have done it blind. She found the one window 20 feet up a sheer face narrow as a hand. She found no other opening. She found nothing at all except that wall of packed stone across the door, and the more she looked at it, the less she believed it. Because here was the thing that would not leave her alone. Sealing a door like that is expensive. It is days of work. It is a mason or two masons in a mortar mix that isn't cheap, hauled up a mile of track that even a cart could not manage. Nobody spends that kind of money and effort to close a building they don't care about. You care about a place you seal. You seal what you are trying to keep. Or she thought, standing there on a gray afternoon with her split thumb throbbing inside its rag, you seal what you are trying to keep out. So, Bracken started digging in the third week. Not everywhere, that was what she noticed. He was not a digging dog. The leg made him careful, and he had never in 6 years done more than scrape a bed in the straw. But every day, sometimes twice a day, he limped to the same 3 feet of ground at the base of the tower, the north side where the wall met the earth, and worked at it with his front paws until she called him off. The first time she thought rabbit. The second time she thought rat. The fourth time she knelt down beside him and put her own hand into the hollow he'd made and felt under 6 inches of turf and sea-blown soil, the flat top of a dressed stone, not rubble, dressed, squared, with a chamfer on the edge that no glacier ever put there. She sat back on her heels with her heart going hard and said out loud, "There's something under this." Bracken looked at her and then looked at the tower and made a small sound in his throat that she had heard exactly twice before in his life, both times at a stranger on the road at night. She stopped digging. She stood up. She turned around. And that was when she saw the boot print. So it was in the mud inside the gatehouse gap on the sheltered side of the stump where the wet held. It was a man's a good 3 sizes past her own, with a square heel and a line of hobnails across the ball of the foot, and it was pointed inward towards the courtyard, and it was clean. It had rained hard on the Tuesday, hard enough that she had spent the day in the pantry with her knees under her chin, listening to water come through the flags. The print had no rain pitting in it at all. Its edges were sharp. Somebody had walked into Corby Craig after Tuesday. Somebody who was not her, and who had not knocked, and who had not called out, and who had not left again by the same route because there was no matching print facing out. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went and got the iron bar she used for levering, and she carried it back to the pantry, and she put it on the floor beside where she slept. That night she did not sleep at all. It came just after midnight, or what she took for midnight. She had no clock, only the tide and the cold. Bracken woke first. He did not bark. He came up off the straw in complete silence, with his hackles standing in a ridge from his shoulders to his tail. And that silence was the most frightening thing Bee had experienced in 25 years of life, because a dog that does not bark is a dog that has decided barking would be a mistake. She got the boards off the window slit with her fingernails. There was a light on the headland. It was moving slowly at about walking pace along the line of the curtain wall from the seaward end towards the gatehouse. A lantern shuddered down to a slot the way men carry them when they want to see the ground and not be seen carrying it. It stopped. It hung there perhaps 40 feet from where she stood, with her cheek against wet stone and her whole body locked rigid. It swung once low as though whoever held it had crouched. It was at the north side of the tower. It was exactly precisely at the place where the dog had been digging. Bee's hand found Bracken's collar and closed on it and held, and she felt him trembling under her fingers with his teeth bared and no sound at all coming out of him. And she thought with the strange flat calm that comes when fear has gone all the way through you and out the other side. They know it's there. Whatever it is, they know, and they've known for years, and they've been coming up here to check on it because nobody ever lived here to see them do it. And now somebody does. The lantern lifted. It moved again faster now, back the way it had come. And then, without any warning at all, it went out, not carried away over the brow, not shrunk with distance, but out in an instant, as though a hand had dropped the shutter, which meant whoever was holding it had stopped needing to see, which meant they had stopped walking, which meant that somewhere out there in the black on her headland, 40 feet from the wall, she was standing behind a man, was standing perfectly still in the dark waiting. B. Kello reached down and picked up the iron bar and did not put it down again until the sky went gray. She went out at first light with the bar in her hand and the dog at her hip, and she went straight to the north side of the tower because she needed to know before she could be afraid properly. The hollow Bracken had dug was filled in. Not roughly, not kicked over. Someone had knelt there in the dark and pressed the turf back down and settled it with the flat of a hand, and the only reason she could tell it all was that the grass was lying the wrong way combed north, when every other blade on that headland lay combed south, because the wind had never once in 60 years blown from any other quarter. Bee crouched and put her fingers on it and felt her own heartbeat in her split thumb. A man had been within 40 feet of where she slept. He had not come to the pantry. He had not tried the door. He had come to this exact patch of ground, and he had found a dog's diggings, and his first instinct before running, before hiding, before anything had been to tidy up. That told her more than a confession would have. A thief takes and goes. A frightened man runs. Only somebody who intends to come back again next month and the month after bothers to make the ground look untouched. "You've been doing this a long while," she said out loud, "haven't you?" She stood up and looked at the whole headland with entirely new eyes, and what she saw was not a ruin anymore. It was a place somebody had been maintaining. Not repairing, maintaining, keeping in a particular condition, keeping shut. And she had walked into the middle of it with 9 shillings and a lame dog. She spent that day doing something that would have looked to any observer like nothing at all. She walked the perimeter with a length of knotted cord, and she counted. She counted the courses in the curtain wall where it stood and where it had gone. She counted the sound sections of the kitchen range roof. She counted mostly the ways in, and there were 4. And by dusk, she had blocked 3 of them with stacked stones she'd already sorted, which took her 11 hours and cost her the fingernail on her left forefinger. And she left the 4th open on purpose, because Enid Sowerby had once said that the way to know a thief is to leave him one door and watch it. Then she took a splinter of charcoal from her fire and drew a line across the mud of that 4th gap and covered it lightly with sand and went to bed with the bar under her hand. Nobody came. Not that night, not the next. On the 3rd night, she woke to Bracken's silence again and lay rigid for 40 minutes and heard nothing whatsoever. And in the morning, the charcoal line was unbroken, and she felt so violently disappointed that she sat down on a stone and laughed at herself until it turned into something else. Because that was the trouble with it. She could not eat suspicion. She had 11 days of oatmeal left, and October was ending, and whoever walked her headland at midnight was not going to send up firewood. Angus Bell was the mason at Kirkhaven, 71 years old, with hands so knotted by arthritis they no longer opened all the way, and eyes the pale, hard blue of a man who has spent a lifetime judging whether a thing is plum. He was sitting outside his door, working a chisel on a whetstone when Bea came down the hill, and he did not stop working when she stopped in front of him. "Mr. Bell, I want to hire you and your son. 4 days." "No, you haven't heard the work." "I've heard the address." She had prepared for this. She had prepared for it the whole way down. She took out her purse and counted 6 shillings into her own palm, nearly everything she had left in the world after the loaf and the bacon, and held it where he could see it. "Good silver, half now. The work is to open the sealed doorway of the sea tower safely in the proper order, so the wall above it doesn't come down on anybody's head." The chisel stopped. "You want the corby opened." "I want my own front door back." Angus Bell laughed at that one dry note, and then he did something she had not expected. He looked past her up the street in both directions before he answered. A man of 71 checking who was watching. "Away home, lassie." "Mr. Bell." I said no, and then lower harder and not unkindly. "There's men on this coast that'll no thank me. You're young and you dinna ken what you're stood in the middle of. Away hame." She came back the next day. He said no. She came back the day after that, and she did not bring the money at all. She brought a question instead, and she asked it, standing in the road where anyone could hear. "Who built that seal?" Angus Bell's chisel came down flat on his knee. "What?" "The blocking in that doorway. It's coursed, it's keyed, and it's mortared with something that hasn't weathered back in 60 years. That is not a collapse, and it is not amateur work. Somebody paid a mason to do that, somebody good." She let it sit for a second. "And there's only ever been one family of masons in Kirkhaven, has there, Mr. Bell?" The old man looked at her for a long, long moment. "You've an awful quick eye," he said, "for a lassie wi' nae boots." "I've got boots." "You've got boots the day." You'll no have them by January. He stood up and it took him a while, and when he was upright, he was 6 inches shorter than she was, and it made no difference at all. Bring the silver the morn, and bring it in a purse where naebody sees ye counting it. Davy'll come up with the barrows. Thank you. Dinna thank me either, Angus Bell said. You'll notice a lot of that on this coast. Davy Bell was 30 and built like a byre door and had not in his father's estimation ever once had an original thought, which was a slander. B disproved within an hour of him arriving. He walked the blocked doorway, twice ran his thumb along the joint and said, That's no our mortar. Whose is it? Naebody's. No round here. He scraped a little onto his palm and crushed it. There's a deal of ash in that. Ash and something gritty. That's a mix a man makes when he's in a hurry, and he's no got proper lime, and he'll no send doing the hill for it because he disna want a cart coming up. He looked at her. Whoever did yawn didn't want witnesses either. They worked 4 days. It was slow because Angus made them take it in reverse order of building top course. First 1 stone at a time, wedged and eased and lowered, never levered, and every evening B paid them in silver, and every evening Davy carried the empty barrows down the hill in the dark, so the village would not see them full. On the 4th afternoon, the last of the packing came out, and the doorway of the sea tower stood open for the first time since 1812. The ground floor was a single round chamber under a stone vault 40 feet across with a fireplace big enough to stand up in and a stair curling away into the wall. It was dry. That was the thing that stopped all 3 of them in the entrance. 60 years shut, and it was dry because whoever sealed it had understood the flues and left the high window open and let the tower breathe. Angus Bell stood in the middle of that floor with his hat in his hands like a man in a kirk. They didn't abandon this, he said. They pit it away, like a body pits away a good coat. B went up the stair with a candle. 2 more rooms, both floored, both sound, both empty, swept, she realized. Actually swept. There was no 60 years of dust in them because there had been nothing to make dust. Nothing at all. Not a stick of furniture, not a rag, not a nail, which meant somebody had emptied the tower first and then walled it. She came down and told them, and Davy whistled, and Angus said nothing whatsoever. And when B turned round, the old man was looking at the fireplace with an expression on his face she could not read at all. Mr. Bell, that's a gay, deep hearth, he said, for a room this size. Then he put his hat on and said the light was going, and they'd be away, and he took his son down the hill, and he did not come back for 11 weeks. She had 6 days of meal left and no way to buy more. And the answer to that arrived humiliatingly in the shape of a man with a theodolite. He was on her headland at 8 in the morning, driving pegs into her ground, and she came over the rubble at him with the bar in her hand and her temper entirely gone. Take those up, he straightened. Mid-30s weathered Sandy with the harassed look of a man who had been shouted at before and expected to be again. Morning, I've permission from the estate to... The estate doesn't own this headland. I do. Take them up. You're Miss Kello. Take up my pegs. He took up the pegs, all 11 of them, one after another, without another word of argument, and stacked them neatly. And then he stood there holding his hat and said, My name's Callum Ross. I'm the harbor surveyor for the Kirkhaven Trust. And you're right, I should have come to your door first and I didn't, and there's no good reason for it beyond habit. What habit? The habit of nobody living here, he said. That took the wind out of her, rather. She stood there with the bar hanging from her hand, feeling absurd. Why are you surveying a cliff? Because there's a scheme to run a breakwater arm out from this point, been talked about for 30 years. He gestured at the water without looking at it. It's the only ground on 11 miles of coast that's deep enough, close in, and hard enough to build on. Everything else is sand. And if it's built, then Kirkhaven's boats stop drowning in the winter, and the herring go out by rail instead of rotting, and 40 families stop being poor. He put his hat back on. And whoever owns this point sells it for a very great deal of money. B felt the world tilt very slightly under her. How much money? Callum Ross looked at her for a moment, and she saw him decide to answer honestly, and she saw that it cost him something. £4,000, he said. Give or take. That's the figure the trust has had in its minute book since 1871. 4,000. They had offered her 60. She turned round and walked 6 paces away from him and stood facing the empty hall with her back to the sea, because she did not want a stranger watching her face while she did the sum. They had offered her 60 pounds and a ruin. Threlfall had sat in that room with his leather case and called it charity, a liability with a view. And every one of them, Rupert Pike, the Duke's factor, had been sitting in an office in a county where a minute book had said 4,000 pounds for 3 years. Miss Kello, does the Ravensmuir estate know that figure? Everyone knows that figure. It's not a secret. It's in the trust minutes. Anybody can. He stopped. She watched him get there. She watched his face change. God. Say it. They gave you this place, Callum Ross said slowly. Threlfall gave you this place. And Threlfall sat at the Harbor Trust table every quarter since 1868. She did not sleep that night either, but for once it had nothing to do with lanterns. She sat with her back to the pantry wall and the dog's head on her foot, and she took the deed out of the trunk and read it by firelight for the 9th time, and this time she was not reading it as a gift. Grants assigns and dispones to Beatrice Ann Kello, her heirs and assignees, whomsoever, all in whole, the Tower, Fortalice, and policies of Corby Craig. Perfect. Clean. Properly worded. Not one thing wrong with it that a solicitor could point to, except the date was in a different ink. She had filed that away in Balcarron because she had been hungry and frightened and in no position to ask questions. She took it out now and turned it over, and for the first time she made herself ask the question properly, the way Enid taught her to ask questions about ledgers, not what does this mean, but what would have to be true for this to happen. For a deed's body to be a week older than its date, someone had to have drawn it up a week early, which meant that a week before she refused 60 pounds, Silas Threlfall already knew she was going to be offered a ruin, which meant it was never an alternative at all. It was the plan. The 60 pounds was the thing she was supposed to refuse. Bee sat very still. They wanted me to take it, she said to the dog. They wanted her to take a headland worth 4,000 pounds, which made no sense at all unless they were certain they could take it back. The thing that broke it open was arithmetic, and it happened on a Tuesday in November while she was doing something else entirely. She had been measuring the tower for a roof she could not afford, pacing the inside of the ground floor chamber, heel to toe, and she wrote the number on a slate in charcoal 39 feet across inside face to inside face. Then, because she was cold and it kept her moving, she walked the outside with the knotted cord, 3 times to be sure, and the outside came to 162 feet round. She sat down on the doorstep with the slate on her knees, and she did it the way Enid had drilled into her at the kitchen table 20 years before, when a girl of 5 was being taught that numbers are the only thing in a house that cannot lie to you. 162 feet round. Divide by 22, multiply by 7. 51.5 feet across the outside. 39 feet across the inside. 12.5 feet of stone divided between 2 walls. 6 feet 3 of wall on either side. Bee stared at the slate. 6 feet 3. She went and stood at the doorway and looked at the reveal where the jamb ran through at the actual measurable thickness of the wall. She could reach out and touch with both hands, and she measured it 4 times, and it was the same 4 times. It was 2 feet 2 inches. 2 feet 2 of wall, 6 feet 3 of stone. There were 4 feet of something in that wall that were not accounted for by anything. She sat down on the floor of her own tower in the cold and put her hands over her mouth and made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Stone remembers, she said through her fingers. Oh, Enid. Oh, you clever old woman. And then she looked up slowly at the fireplace. The fireplace Angus Bell had stood in front of with his hat in his hands. The fireplace he had called gay deep for a room this size. The fireplace he had looked at for a full 10 seconds before he suddenly remembered the light was going and took his son home for 11 weeks. The back of that hearth was on the seaward side, which was where the 4 feet were. She broke through the following afternoon, and it took her 6 hours and cost her the skin off both palms and 3 of the 4 fingernails on her right hand. The stones at the back of the hearth were mortared with the same ashy gray mix as the doorway. She chipped at one joint with the bar and a stone splinter until she could get a purchase, and when it finally shifted, it went inward, not outward, and fell away into a space that swallowed the sound of it. She widened the hole until her shoulders would go through. She lit her second-to-last candle. Bracken tried to follow her, and she pushed him back twice, and he went in anyway on his belly because he had spent 6 years deciding where she went. He went. And this was not a day he was going to be argued out of it. Inside was a chamber 4 feet wide and perhaps 12 long, curving with the wall with a stone floor and a vaulted head, and a slot in the outer face no wider than a hand that let in a thin gray line of daylight in 60 years of sea air, which was why the tower had never rotted. It was empty. Not empty like the rooms above. Empty like a room somebody had taken things out of. There was straw on the floor, old, flattened, disturbed. There were two long, parallel scores in the stone, 4 feet apart, running from the middle of the chamber towards the hole she'd just made, the kind of marks a heavy thing with iron corners leaves when it is dragged. And at the far end on its side against the wall was a small, carved wooden bird. Bee knelt in the straw and picked it up. A seabird whittled by somebody who was not an artist, worn smooth and dark, down one whole side by decades of a thumb, going over it and over it and over it, the way a person handles a thing when they are waiting for someone who is not coming home. She held it and she felt the disappointment go through her like cold water. The pure animal grief of it, 6 hours of work and 4 feet of masonry, and nothing. And underneath the grief arriving, about 2 seconds later, was something much worse. Somebody had already been here. Somebody had come through this wall before her and taken out whatever had been in this room and gone away again, and the only reason she had needed 6 hours with a bar was that they had mortared it shut behind them. She turned the candle, and there at the edge of her hole where she'd broken through, she could see it now that she knew to look. The courses were not 60 years old. They were the same stone, yes, and the same ashy mortar, but they had been laid by a man working from the inside in a confined space, and one of them was set proud by half an inch because he could not get his arm behind it to level it. "You came in through the hearth," she said aloud, and her voice came out shaking. "You emptied it and you built it back, and then you went outside and sealed the front door so nobody would ever wonder why the hearth was deep. 60 years ago, and somebody was still walking the headland at midnight with a shuttered lantern, checking. Bracken had stopped listening to her some time ago. He was at the far end of the chamber where the straw was thickest, working at the floor with his one good front paw and his nose down, making the small, urgent noise in his throat that she had learned meant here, and she said, "Bracken, leave it." And he did not leave it, and she crawled down with the candle to pull him off and saw what he had uncovered. A niche, low in the wall at floor level, no bigger than a bread oven, with the straw kicked over it and a flat stone laid across the front of it. And the stone was still there undisturbed because a man dragging out a heavy chest by candlelight in a 4-foot passage looks at what is in front of him and not at his own feet. Bee got her fingers round the edge and pulled it out. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with tarred twine, was a tin box. She sat back against the wall of the tower with it on her knees, and she found that she could not open it because her hands had started to shake so hard that she could not work the knot, and she had to stop and press them flat against the cold floor for a full minute before she could try again. The twine came apart and her fingers rotten. The oilcloth was stiff and cracked and gave up in sheets. Inside the tin dry, as the day they went in, were papers. 3 things, and she took them out one at a time, and with every one of them, the room got quieter. The first was a letter 4 pages in a small, careful hand, and the first line of it was, "To whoever comes into this room, and I pray to God it is not the man I think it will be." The second was a parchment with a great cracked seal of green wax hanging off it on a cord dated 1798, and the language was Latinate and antique and impenetrable at first glance. But Bee had spent 4 years keeping her father's rent books, and she found her way to the operative words in about 40 seconds, and when she found them, she stopped breathing. "To the said Andrew Crate, keeper of the said tower and fortalice, and to the heirs of his body lawfully begotten in perpetuity." The third thing was not one thing. It was 3 bound volumes, foolscap marbled boards, each one a good 2 inches thick, and stamped on the front of every one of them in faded gilt were the words, "Ravens Muir Estate Protocol Book of Instruments." She opened the first one at random. Page after page after page of instruments, tax, renewals, removals, discharges, conveyances, every one of them copied out, fair, every one of them dated, and every one of them stamped at the foot with the same notarial seal she had watched Silas Threlfall press into her own deed of gift in a room that smelled of sealing wax and Balcarin. Bee Kello sat in a 4-foot chamber inside a 6-foot wall with a dog's chin on her ankle and 11 days of oatmeal in the world. and understood that whoever had come into this room 60 years ago had taken the money and left the paper, and that either they had not understood what the paper was, or they had understood exactly what it was and had known that a chest of coin can be spent and forgotten, and that 3 protocol books hidden in a wall by a woman who was already frightened were the only thing on this entire coast that could not. She turned back to the first page of the letter. The candle was down to an inch. She read it anyway out loud because the silence in that wall was more than she could hold on her own. "My name is Isabel Cragg," she read. "I am the widow of Andrew Cragg, keeper of Corby Cragg, drowned off the Mull in the February of 1808. It is my belief that the factor of the Ravensmuir estate has been altering the writs of this coast for 11 years, and that when he learns what I have kept, he will come for me. I have sealed this tower with my own hands and the help of a man from the village who I will not name here because they will ask him." She stopped. She put her wrist against her mouth. Then she read the rest of the sentence. "If you are reading this, then you are living in my tower and they have not yet found it. Do not run. Running is what they are counting on. Keep the books and keep them where the sea can't get them. And when you have counted enough of them to be sure, count them. Do not guess. Take them down that hill and put them in front of people who cannot afford to look away." The candle guttered. "I could not do it," the last line said. "I was one woman and I was afraid, and I told myself that the stones would outlast them. The stones did outlast them. It was not enough. It took her 11 hours to walk to Balcarron with a barrow, and she arrived at 5 in the afternoon of the 11th with blisters through both heels and slept in the yard of a carrier's inn for 4 pence, sitting up with the barrow roped to her wrist and the dog across her feet. At 10 the next morning, she pushed it through the door of the sheriff court, and a macer told her she could not bring a barrow in, and she said, "Then you'll carry the books." And he looked at her face and carried 3 of them. Rupert was already there. He had counsel of Mr. Gilfillan's silk gown, Edinburgh voice, and Rupert had that scrubbed, hopeful look of a man who has been told by an expert that everything will be fine. Threlfall sat behind them with his leather case on his knees and did not turn round once the whole day, not one single time. B had no counsel. She had 11 shillings and a barrow. Sheriff Substitute Hume was 60-odd with a dry voice and the manner of a man who had spent 30 years listening to people lie to him and had stopped finding it interesting. "Miss Kellow, you appear on your own behalf." "I do, my lord." "You understand you are entitled to be represented." "I understand I'm entitled to be represented if I can pay for it." A small sound went round the room. Hume did not smile, but something moved behind his face. "Very well, Mr. Gilfillan, this is your motion." Gilfillan took 18 minutes, and he did it beautifully. The deed of gift executed in favor of Miss Kellow was notarially defective. The commission of Silas Threlfall, notary public, had lapsed at Martinmas 1869 and had not been renewed. The instrument was therefore a nullity ab initio. It never operated. The subjects of Corby Cragg had never left the Kellow Trust. He asked the court to declare it so and to find Miss Kellow liable in expenses. "She has, I am instructed, effected certain improvements," he said. "My client is prepared to be reasonable about a small allowance. He wishes it recorded that he bears his sister no ill will whatsoever." B sat with her hands on the top protocol book and let him finish. "Miss Kellow, do you oppose the motion?" "No, my lord." That went through the room like a stone through glass. Gilfillan's head came round. Rupert half rose. Hume put down his pen. "You do not oppose it." "Every word of it is correct," B said. "The commission lapsed at Martinmas 1869. The seal was dead, and the deed's a nullity. I've known it since February, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise to save my own roof." "Then what is it you want?" "I want the court to apply the same rule to the other 139. The macer had to ask twice for quiet. Hume leaned forward. "Explain that." "These are the protocol books of the Ravensmuir estate for 1862 to 1874. They were hidden in a wall at Corby Cragg in 1812 by a woman called Isabel Cragg. The first 2 volumes are earlier, and I'll come to those. The third is the one that matters this morning." She opened it. "Every instrument in these books is copied fair and dated and sealed. I've indexed all 462. I did it in 9 weeks on ruled paper, and I'll hand the sheets up if the court wants them." "You indexed 462 instruments." I counted them, my lord. I didn't guess. There's a difference, and I was told to mind it. Go on. Before Martinmas 1869, the estate used 3 notaries. Mr. Purves of this town, a Mr. Cowan, and Mr. Threlfall. After Martinmas 1869, it used one. 140 instruments, 4 years, 1 seal, and it was the seal that had just died. She turned the book round so it faced the bench. My deed is one of them. It's the last one. There are 139 standing in front of it, and 41 of those are removings. Removings, Hume repeated. Evictions, my lord. People put out of their houses on paper that was worth nothing. 11 of them on one morning at Caldham Row, the 11th of March, 1871. 51 people, and I've got their names off the schedule, and every one of those families was told the writ was not for them to see because it was for the court. She kept her voice flat because it was the only way to get through it. It wasn't for the court. It was never for anybody. It was a stamp a man had no right to be holding. Philin was on his feet. He came at her the way she had known he would, and he came at the only place she was soft. My lord, before this goes an inch further, these volumes are the property of the Ravensmuir estate. They are marked as such on the boards. I am instructed that they have been missing from the estate office for some considerable time, and I would like Miss Kello to explain to this court on oath, if necessary, how they came into her hands. Mr. Gilfillan, I say the word plainly, my lord, because someone must. Theft. This woman is asking your lordship to unpick the writs of an entire estate on the strength of documents she cannot lawfully account for. B felt the room change temperature. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for it for 6 weeks lying awake, and every version she had prepared was an argument. And standing there, she understood that an argument was exactly what he wanted, because an argument is 2 people's word, and his was worth more than hers. So she did not argue. My lord, she said, I can't prove where those books were before 1812. I wasn't born. Nobody in this room was born. She put both hands flat on the table. But I can prove where they were after it, and I can't prove it with my mouth. There's a man outside who can prove it with his hands, and he's 71 years old, and he came 100 miles on a cart because he thought somebody might ask this exact question. Hume's eyebrows went up. Bring him in. Angus Bell came up the aisle with his hat in both hands and his son behind him, and he took the oath in a voice like a gate. You're a mason, 53 year. My father afore me and his father afore him. There's been a bell laying stone in Kirkhaven since 1740, and there's the parish register to say it. Mr. Bell, B said, you opened the sealed doorway of the sea tower at Corby Craig last October. What did you find? I found work, Angus said. Guide work, coursed, keyed, and leveled by a man that kent his trade. How old a twum? Yon mortar's a lime mix wi' wood ash and beach grit. Nabody's mixed that on this coast since the 60s, the 1760s. He turned his head to the bench, and to B's astonishment, he addressed Hume directly the way a man addresses another tradesman. My lord, I'll tell ye how ye ken. Ash mortar carbonates fay the face in. It gaes hard and it gaes grey, and ye can date it by the depth of the grey, the same as ye'd count rings in a tree. That blocking's grey, the hail rode through. 6 inch. That's 60 year and mair, and I'll pit my name to it in ony court in Scotland. And the chamber inside the wall. Same mortar on the hearth back. Same hand. He paused. Sealed fay the inside mine. There's a stain set proud because the man couldn't get his arm a hinted. That's a body working a lane in a 4-foot hole. That's no thieving. That's hiding. Gilfillan tried, you cannot possibly. And Angus Bell turned on him, 71 years old, hat crushed in his fists. Sir, I've laid stain for 53 year, and I've never once been telt by a gentleman in a goon what year my ain mortar gaed hard. His voice went up and broke, and he did not care. That wall was shut afore my grandfather was breached. Yon lassie didna steal they books. She dug them oot wi' her ain hands, and she broke every nail on the right one dane it, and I'll no sit doon while ye stand there and ca' her a thief. The macer said order, and nobody heard him. Hume let it settle. Then he said quite mildly, Mr. Gilfillan, I take the point on custody to be answered. Sit down. My lord, with respect, there remains the question of homologation. Yes, there does. Make it. And Gilfillan made it, and it was the best thing he did all day, and for about 4 minutes, B thought she had lost everything. Because his argument was this: a defect in form may be cured where the parties have acted upon the writ over time. The Caldham tenants had gone. They had not objected. 3 years had passed. They had, by their own conduct, accepted the position. The court could not now, on the motion of a woman with no interest in those subjects whatsoever, reopen 41 settled removings. Nobody complained, my lord, Gilfillan said. For 3 years, nobody complained. That silence is not nothing in law. It is acquiescence. B stood up before she was called. My lord, Miss Kello, you'll have your turn. He's just told this court that because they were frightened, they agreed. Her voice came out louder than she meant it to. I need to say something to that, or I'll not be able to live in my own head. Hume looked at her for a long moment. Say it. 51 people were put out of their houses in March. In the March, my lord, 9 of them were bairns. They went to Kirkhaven and they went into other folks' back rooms, and some of them went on the parish. And the reason they didn't complain is that the man who put them out held the lease of the harbor, the smokehouse, and the ground their new roof stood on. She had stopped being able to keep it flat. I know that because when I stood up in the Kirk Hall 3 weeks ago and asked 38 people to come here today, not one of them would. And then they poured seawater in my lime, and they turned Angus Bell's son off the boats, and 8 days ago somebody kicked my dog into a ditch and left him for dead 100 yards from my own gate. Miss Kello, they're not here because they're afraid, and he's standing there telling you that proves they were content. She was shaking, and she let herself shake. That's not acquiescence, my lord. That's a man counting on the thing that made it possible in the first place. And I'm the only one who can afford to say so. And the only reason I can afford it is that I've got nothing left to take. The room was completely silent. Hume put his pen down. That, he said, is not a bad answer on homologation. Then Callum Ross stood up at the back. B had not known he was there. She had not asked him. She had deliberately not asked him because she had done the sum on his behalf in July and decided she had no right to. My lord, Callum Ross, I'm the surveyor to the Kirkhaven Harbor Trust, and I'd like to give evidence, and I'd like to do it now before I lose my nerve. Hume said, take the book. I took it, and he did not look at B once, and afterwards she thought that was probably the only way he could have got through it. In 1869, I took the levels off Corby Craig Point over 11 days. I recorded soundings averaging 4 feet deeper than the figures that appear on the plan lodged in the Trust's minute book. That plan carries my signature. The figures on it are not mine. You are saying the plan was altered after you signed it. I'm saying the figures were changed and my name was left on. The effect of the change is that Corby Craig Point reads as unsuitable for a breakwater, and Balcarron Bay reads as suitable. Balcarron Bay is Ravensmuir ground. He swallowed. The plan was countersigned by Silas Threlfall. When did you become aware of this? In the spring of 1870, my lord. That is 5 years. Yes. And you said nothing? No. Why? And Callum Ross said, because he sat on the committee that renewed my contract and I wanted to keep it. He said it straight at the bench. There's no better reason than that. I've been looking for one for 5 years and there isn't one. I'd like the court to record that I'm not here because I'm honest. I'm here because a woman I know gutted 1,100 herring a day for 9 months to buy candles to read those books by, and I couldn't go on being the man who watched. Behind him, Threlfall stood up for the first time and walked out of the room, and the macer stopped him at the door and he sat back down. It was Effie Gillen who came in next, and B never entirely understood how, because she had not sent word and Effie had no money for a cart. She had walked 31 miles overnight with 2 others behind her. She stood in the box in her working clothes with her hands red to the wrist and told the court what happened at her door on the 11th of March, 1871, and she did it in about 2 minutes without one word of self-pity, and the only time her voice went was when Hume asked her how old her youngest had been. Fower, my lord, she's 8 no. She still asks Tegang Ham. Then Tam Rory, who had carried Bay North on a cart in September and told her he didn't hold with ghosts. I've carted for Ravensmuir 22 year. In the March of 71, I was told to take 11 families' gear to the shore road in Pittadune. No te a hoose. T the road. He turned his hat. I did it. I've thought about it every March since. Then Mrs. Vint, who had refused B credit in October and told her the Corby was not theirs to help, and who now stood up in a sheriff court in Balcaron in her good coat and said, I refused that lassie a sack of meal when she'd 9 shillings to her name, because I was furt and I've had tay live we it a winter. I'll no be feared the day. And then Wool Tarrant, who had 4 bairns and had put her off the fish on the Friday, and who came in without looking at anybody, and said his piece and went and sat down and put his head in his hands. 9 of them in the end, 9 out of the 38 who had looked at the floor. B sat at the table with her hand on the protocol books and did not trust herself to turn round. Hume rose at 1 and came back at 3. And before he gave his decision, he did an unusual thing. He asked B to hand up the earliest volume, the one from before 1812, and he read it himself on the bench for 11 minutes while nobody in that room moved. Then he said, Miss Kello, there is a document in this box that no one has yet spoken to, the Charter of 1798. Have you read it? I have, my lord. Read it aloud from the operative words. She stood up and found the line, and her voice went thin. To the said Andrew Craig, keeper of the said tower and fortalice, and to the heirs of his body lawfully begotten in perpetuity. In perpetuity, Hume said, not at pleasure, not during the estate's will, in perpetuity to the heirs of his body. He looked at her over his spectacles. Miss Kello, what was your mother's name? B opened her mouth and nothing came out. Her name, Miss Kello. Margaret, she said, Margaret. And then she heard it and her hand went out and found the edge of the table. Margaret Crack. My mother's name was Margaret Crack. She was born at Kirkhaven. Yes, Hume said. So the parish register your Mr. Bell brought me this morning would suggest. Andrew Craig, keeper. His son's daughter, Margaret, and you. The room made a noise B heard as though from underwater. My lord, Gilfillan, very fast now. My lord, that cannot be. The estate has held those subjects. The estate has possessed those subjects, Hume said. It has never once shown me a writ that took them out of the crack line, and I have now read 462 of its instruments because a fish gutter indexed them for me on a wrapping paper. He set the charter down. Mr. Gilfillan, your client did not own Corby Craig. He could not give it to his sister in September, and he cannot take it back from her today. Not because the seal was dead, because it was never his. B did not hear the next part properly. She heard it and she could repeat it afterwards, and she could not have told anyone how it felt at the time, except that her ears rang. The deed of gift was reduced as a nullity, which changed nothing because the subjects had never been in the Kello Trust at all. Declarator granted in favor of Beatrice Ann Kello as heir of the body of Andrew Craig. The 140 instruments executed under a lapse commission were remitted for examination one by one, with the 41 removings taken first, and every family removed on a void writ found entitled to restitution from the Ravensmuir estate. Silas Threlfall's instruments were reduced, and the papers sent to the Procurator Fiscal. Rupert Kello was found liable in the expenses of the action. And there was a thing that happened in the corridor afterwards, which B kept to herself for a long time. Lord Ravensmuir's man came out, not the Duke. His man, a pleasant person in a good coat, and found her by the door with the barrow. Miss Kello, his lordship's very distressed. He knew nothing of any of this, and he's instructed me to say so. He'd like to make a private arrangement, generously, for yourself and for the families. Very generously. It would spare everybody a great deal of unpleasantness in the newspapers, and I'm sure his lordship's mind, no. I don't think you've heard the figure. I don't want the figure, B said. You can pay every one of those families in the sheriff court with the door open and a clerk writing it down, or you can pay them nothing, and I'll go to every newspaper between here and Glasgow with 3 protocol books in a barrow. She took hold of the handles. Private arrangements are how this lasted 60 years. He can do it in public, or he can do it in the Herald. That's the whole of the choice, and I'd like you to tell him I was pleasant about it. The decree, when it was extracted 11 weeks later, ordered restitution to be made in open court. Every family was paid across a table with the door open. It took 4 days. Rupert caught her in the yard while she was roping the barrow. He looked 20 years older than he had in June, and he had come out without his hat, and B understood that Honoria was somewhere inside not speaking to him. B, she went on roping, I want you to know I didn't. He stopped, started again. I knew about the 4,000. I've known since 71. I didn't know about the seal, I swear to God. I only found that in June and I used it and I know how that sounds. It sounds true, Bay said. That's the worst of it, Rupert. It sounds completely true. Then, you knew a headland was worth 4,000 pounds and you offered your sister 60 and told her it was generous. You didn't need to forge anything. You didn't need to break a single law. You just needed me to be worth less than the ground I was standing on, and you'd already decided that years before Threlfall ever picked up a stamp. She pulled the knot tight. The law's got nothing for me on that one. There's no writ against it. I've looked. What do you want me to do? She straightened up and looked at him, and she found slightly to her own surprise that she was not angry anymore. She was just tired, and there was a mile of road and a dog waiting. Pay the expenses, she said. Sell what you have to. And when somebody in that house says a person's not worth the feeding bracken, or a housekeeper, or a sister, I want you to remember that you were wrong about it once in front of a sheriff with your name in the paper. She picked up the handles. B, wait, that's it. That's all you're going to say to me. That's all I've got, she said. You'll notice a lot of that on this coast. 3 weeks later, the Harbor Trust wrote to her formally on headed paper and offered 4,200 pounds for the point. She read it in the tower with the fire going, and bracken stretched out on the flags, and she thought about 9 shillings and 4 pence, and 11 days of oatmeal, and a woman crossing a street with half a loaf in a cloth. Then she wrote back and refused to sell. She granted them a servitude instead, a right of access and construction over the point in perpetuity for £1 a year on 3 conditions, which she set out in her own hand, in her own numbered paragraphs, because Enid Sowerby had taught her that a woman who cannot prove what she agreed can be told anything, that the ground remain in the Craik line and be sold to no one ever, that the works be built by men out of Kirkhaven and Caldame, and the Caldame men engaged first by name from the schedule of the 11th of March, 1871, and that a light be maintained on the Towerhead every night of the year at the Trust's expense, and that the keeping of it belonged to whoever lived at Corby Craig. The Trust accepted all 3. Inside a fortnight, and one of the men who signed the minute was Callum Ross, who had been dismissed by that same trust on the 14th of August and reinstated on the 9th of October, by a vote of 11-2 after Angus Bell walked into the meeting uninvited and stood at the back with his hat in his hands until they let him speak. The restitution took 4 days in a room with the door open, and Bee sat through every hour of it on a bench at the back because she had told a corridor full of people that this would be done in public and she was not going to be the one who failed to turn up. It was not triumphant. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had expected she was honest about it. Afterwards, she had expected something that felt like winning. What actually happened was that 51 people came in, one at a time, gave their names, and were handed money across a table by a clerk who read out the date of their eviction and the amount and the words paid in respect of removal upon a void instrument, and almost every one of them cried and almost none of them said anything at all. Effie Gillen took hers, counted it, and put it in her apron. That's a four year and 7 months, she said to nobody in particular. It's no a hoose, it'll buy a roof. On the second day, a man called Sandy Muir came in 68, Caldham Row, put out with a wife who had died the following winter, and when the clerk asked him to confirm his name, he could not do it. He stood there working his jaw. His son had to say it for him. Bee got up and went out into the corridor and stood against the wall with her hand over her mouth for about 3 minutes, and when she came back in, she sat down and did not move again until 4 o'clock. She had thought the paper was the point. She had spent 9 weeks with ruled columns, believing that if she could only get the arithmetic in front of a man who could not afford to look away, the thing would be fixed. The arithmetic had worked. It had worked completely. And it had not given Sandy Muir his wife back, and it had not given a child of 8 the house she still asked to go home to. And B. Kello sat on a bench in Balcarron and understood at 26 that being right does not undo anything. It only stops it happening to the next 51 people. That had to be enough. She decided on that bench that she would make it be enough. Silas Threlfall was tried at the spring circuit, and it lasted 2 days, and he did not once look at her, not even when she gave her evidence, not even when she was 11 feet from him with her hand on a book. He was convicted on 41 counts and sentenced to 5 years. His defense, and this was the thing Bea thought about for years afterwards, long after she had stopped thinking about him as a person at all, His defense was that he had forgotten. I had not renewed his commission in 1869 because his wife had been ill that autumn and the notice had come and gone. And then a month passed and a writ needed sealing, and he sealed it because what else was he to do, ride to Edinburgh over a piece of paperwork, and then another, and then a year. And by 1871, the thing had gone so far past mending that the only possible way through it was forward. I did not set out to do it, he said in the dock. And it was the only sentence of the entire trial that Belle believed. There was never a morning I decided, it was only ever the next one. She thought about that on the cart home. She thought about it for months, because it meant there had been no villain sitting in a room rubbing his hands. There had been a tired man in an office in November who let one thing slide and then had to protect the slide and then had to protect the protection. And 51 people had gone out onto a shore road in March because of the shape of that, and every single person who had suspected it had decided it was not their business to say. That was the whole machine. There was nothing clever in it anywhere. Lord Ravensmuir was not charged with anything because he had genuinely known nothing, and B found that she believed that too, and found that it did not comfort her in the least. A man who owns 11,000 acres and does not know what is being done in his name has not been deceived. He has been comfortable. He paid every penny of the restitution. He also in the March sent her a letter offering to have the tower re-roofed at his own expense as a mark of regret. B wrote back 3 lines thanking him and declining, and then sat for a while with the pen in her hand and added a 4th. If your lordship wishes to mark it, the men of Caldham are living 11 to a cottage, and there is ground at Caldham Row standing empty, and your lordship owns it. 11 houses went up at Caldham that summer. He never answered the letter. The houses went up. Corby Craig came back slowly, and it came back with other people's hands on it. She had money now, and the strange thing about the money was how little it changed the doing of the work. She still mixed mortar. She still hauled. Angus Bell was 72 and gave orders from a stool and got up off it every 20 minutes to correct his son. The hall stayed roofless on purpose. She had thought about it a long while and decided she did not want a great hall. What she wanted was the garden, and the garden was already there in the raised beds. She and a lame dog had built out of sorted rubble in a winter when she had 11 days of meal. Kale and cabbage leeks and turnips, potatoes in the deep bed against the south wall. Mrs. Vince's daughter came up to help with it twice a week and would not take payment for the first month, which was Mrs. Vince's way of finishing a conversation she had started in a shop in October. The kitchen range was a house by the second autumn. The tower was hers, the round room below with Davy Bell's shelves round the whole curve of it, the 2 rooms above, and the wall chamber left exactly as she had found it, with the flat stone leaned against the wall and the straw swept out and nothing put in. People asked why she didn't use it. It was 4 feet by 12 dry, and she had books enough to fill it 3 times over. Because somebody has to be able to see what it was, she said. She took them in there when they asked properly. Not often. She took them in with a candle and showed them the one stone set proud, where a woman working alone in 1812 could not get her arm behind it, and she let them put their own hand in the gap, and she told them what had been hidden there and for how long, and she watched their faces do the thing that faces do. She never once told that story without saying the last line of Isabel Crake's letter out loud. I was one woman, and I was afraid. The stones did outlast them. It was not enough. The breakwater began in the April. Caldham men first engaged by name, off the schedule of the 11th of March, 1871, because it was in the servitude in her own numbered paragraphs, and the trust clerk had to read the names out at the hiring like a roll call. Sandy Muir's son was 4th on the list. He stood there when his name was said and had to be nudged. It took 2 years and 11 months. B went down most weeks and stood at the end of the arm with the wind taking her hair apart and watched them tip stone into the sea. And on the night the first course came above high water, somebody in Kirkhaven put a lantern in an upstairs window facing the headland, and then somebody else did, and by 10 o'clock there were 19 of them. B stood on her towerhead and counted them twice because she could not believe the number the first time. 19 windows in a village where 9 people out of 38 had been willing to be seen walking a road with her. She did not sleep that night. She sat with her back against the parapet and her arm over the dog and understood something that took her a long time to be able to say without her voice going. They had not been cowards, not one of them. They had been 38 people who each privately knew a true thing and each privately knew that saying it alone would cost them everything, and every one of them had been correct about that. Wold Tarrant had lost the smokehouse lease for 11 months. Davy Bell had lost his place. Callum Ross had been dismissed on the 14th of August at 4 in the afternoon in a letter of 2 sentences. The cost was real. It was always real. It had just never once been divided. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that had let a lapsed stamp run for 4 years in a hidden chamber stay, hidden for 60. Not wickedness. Arithmetic. One person speaking pays everything. 38 speaking and paid almost nothing. And the only way to get from the first to the second is for somebody to stand up and pay everything first alone in front of everyone with no guarantee whatsoever that the others will follow. She had been that person by accident. She was extremely clear about that. She had been that person because she was the only one on that coast with nothing left for them to take. And if she had had 4 barons and a smokehouse lease, she was not at all sure what she would have done. She said so in the Kirk Hall on the anniversary when they asked her to speak, and she had not wanted to. I want to say one thing, and I want to say it plain, because I've heard it said the other way in this village, and it isn't true. She had her hands behind her back so they wouldn't see them. I wasn't brave, I was free. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference. They'd already taken everything off me before I ever opened a book, and that's the only reason I could afford the truth. She looked at Wold Tarrant in the 4th row. Some of you came in August and it cost you, and some of you didn't, and it's been eaten at you ever since, and I want you to stop. Because the next time it happens, and it will happen, it always happens, there'll be 9 of you now instead of 1. That's not nothing, that's the entire thing. Enid Sowerby came in the July. B had written to her 4 times in 2 years and had 4 letters back and had never once said come because Enid was 69 and had a room at her sister's in Balcarron, and Bay had not been able to offer her anything worth having. She could now. The old woman got off Tam Rory's cart at the bottom of the track and refused to be helped up it and took an hour and 10 minutes and stopped twice and would not sit down. She stood in the courtyard and looked at the smoke and the glass and the gate and the garden and the hall, and she did not say anything at all for a long time, and Bee stood there with her heart going like a girl of 9. You've mixed your mortar o'er wet on yon east wall. I know, that was the first month, Angus told me. Aye, well, Enid's chin was not steady. It'll haud. Bee took her into the tower and sat her by the fire and put a cup in her hands, and then she went and got the 3 protocol books off Davy Bell's shelves and put them on the table in front of her. I need you to see these. I've read the papers, lass. The Hale countries read the papers. You don't understand. Bee's voice was not working properly. Enid, I counted them, 462 on wrapping paper in columns, date and parties and subject and seal. I didn't guess. I counted because you told me to count at that kitchen table when I was 5 years old, and you were teaching me the price of a pound of candles. She had to stop. Everything I did up here, I did because of you. Every single thing. I didn't have anything else. I had 9 shillings and a dog and your voice. Enid Sowerby put her cup down and looked into the fire for a while. I said it to ye that often. She said, I thought ye'd stopped hearing it. I heard it every night for 9 months. Aye. The old woman's hand went out and found Bee's wrist and held on hard the way she had held it on a doorstep in September when a girl was getting into a coach with nothing. Stone remembers, paper remembers longer. Keep both. My mither telt me that. She was in service at Ravensmuir lass. 40 year. She saw things gang into that office, and she never saw them come out, and she telt me to keep my ain books till the day she died, and I never once kent why. Bee sat down on the floor beside her chair. Enid. I never once kent why, Enid Sowerby said again, and I've kent for 2 year new, and I'm ower all take ken what tay day with it. She stayed. She had her own room in the range by August, and she ran Bee's accounts until she was 74, and she is buried in Kirkhaven Kirkyard, 11 feet from Isabel Craig, which was not an accident. Rupert and Honoria came in the September of the 3rd year. Bee saw them from the tower head, had a full 4 minutes to decide what she was going to be, and she used every second of it. They came up on foot. That was the first thing. There was no carriage at the bottom of the track and no horses, and Rupert was carrying his own bag. I had sold Kellow House in the spring. Not the whole estate, the trust held most of it, but the house and the home farm, and the walled garden with the ornate iron lock that B had a key to in her pocket for 11 years. They were in a leased place at Auchenford with 3 servants instead of 9, and Honoria's family had made it extremely clear what they thought of the whole business. They stopped at the gate. And this was the part that B told nobody about ever except Callum once years later. They didn't know her. Not for a moment. Not the whole moment. She was standing in the courtyard in a wool dress with her sleeves rolled and limed to the elbow, and her hair tied back, and her hands. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had goaded 1,100 herring a day and mixed mortar for 3 years, and they were 40 years old on a body of 28, and Honoria's eyes went straight over her to the door of the range, looking for the mistress of the house. "We're looking for Miss Kello," Honoria said. B let it hang for exactly as long as it needed to. "Hello, Honoria." Honoria's hand went to her collar. Rupert said, "God," very quietly, and put the bag down. She gave them supper. She did it because Enid was watching, and because Bracken had come out and put his head against her leg, and because she found standing there that she did not want to be a person who sent people down a mile of track in the dark to prove a point. They ate at the long table Davy had made. Honoria talked too much for the first half hour and then stopped. Rupert ate almost nothing, and at the end of it he said what he had come to say, and to his credit he said it straight. "I need £800 or we lose the Auchenford lease as well." B folded her hands. "No. B. I'm not going to argue about it, and I'm not going to make you beg, so I'll tell you exactly why, and then we'll talk about something else." She kept her voice completely level. "If I give you £800, you'll spend it, and in 4 years you'll be here again, and you'll have learned that the way out of a hole is your sister. That's what Father did to you. He never once let you feel the floor. I'm not doing it." That's very easy to say from this side of the table. It is. It's extremely easy. I've thought about that. She got up and went to the shelf and came back with a folded paper and put it in front of him. "There's a place going at the Harbor Trust for a clerk to the works. £85 a year and a house at Kirkhaven. It's not a gentleman's position. You'd be under Callum Ross, and half the men on that arm were put out of Caldame Row on paper your factor stamped, and they'd know exactly who you were on the first morning." Rupert stared at it. "You cannot possibly be serious." "I wrote the recommendation this afternoon. It's a good one. It says you keep excellent accounts, which is true, and that you understand estate rents better than anybody in the county, which is also true and is the reason it's worth something." She sat back down. "Take it or don't, but that's what I've got, and it's a great deal more than £60 in a ruin." The silence went on a long time. It was Honoria who broke it, and B had not expected it from her at all. "Take it," she said. "Honoria, take it, Rupert." Her voice was not steady. "I have spent 2 years being looked at in Balcarron. I would rather live in a harbor house among men who despise you for a reason than in a leased villa among people who despise us both for sport." She pushed her plate away. "And she's right about the 800. You know she's right. You've known it since the train. I took the position in the November. He was not good at it for the first year, and he was very good at it after that, and he stayed 19 years, and when the outer arm was finished in 1884, his name went on the brass with the rest of them third from the bottom, and B stood in the crowd and watched him read it and saw him put his hand up to his face. They never became close. She wanted to be honest about that afterwards because people liked to end the story with the two of them reconciled, and it was not true. They became civil. They became a brother and sister who dined 4 times a year and asked after each other's health and did not discuss 1874. Some things are not mended. They are only survived and then built next to. Callum Ross waited 2 years and 9 months and never once asked her. He came up on Sundays. He brought lime he insisted on being paid for because she had told him in the first winter that she wanted to be able to hand somebody a page, and he had understood it and never argued about it again. He learned to mix mortar badly and take instruction from a 72-year-old mason. He sat on her floor and read her columns and found 3 instruments she had miscounted and told her so, and she made him prove it, and he proved it, and she wrote CR in the margin of each and never rubbed it out. He did not court her, and he did not court her, and B knew perfectly well what was happening and let it happen at exactly the speed it was happening, because she had spent 9 months on a cliff learning what it does to a person to be given things by people who expect to be paid in gratitude. She was the one who said it in the end, in the March of the 4th year, standing at the end of the unfinished arm, with the whole village's boats behind them. Callum, I'm going to say a thing and I'd like you to let me finish it before you answer because I've written it out 3 times and I'll lose it. He said, all right, and put his hands in his pockets. I want to marry you. I've wanted it for about a year and a half, and I've said nothing because I needed to be sure it wasn't for the wrong reasons, and I'm sure now. She had her chin up, but I'll only do it on terms, and the terms aren't negotiable. And if any one of them is impossible for you, I'd rather know today than in 10 years. Say them. Say, Corby Craig stays in my name and in the crack line, and it's never sold. Not by me, not by you, not by our children. It's in the servitude, and I'll put it in a marriage contract as well. Yes, I keep my own books and my own money and my own work. And if there's ever a decision about this ground, it's mine, and you'll be consulted the way I'd consult you about the harbor, which is properly and honestly and not as a formality. Yes. And I want you to understand why. Her voice went then for the first time. Because I was worth 60 pounds to the last family I belonged to. They put a number on me, and it was low, and they wrote it down, and they had every legal right to. I'm never going to be in a position where somebody can do that again. Not because I don't trust you, because I don't ever again want to be a person whose worth is somebody else's to decide. Callum Ross took a long breath. B, can I answer now? Yes. I said nothing for 5 years about a plan with my own name on it because I was frightened of a committee. He said it steadily. You went down that hill on the 12th of August with a barrow and a lame dog, and not one person walked with you. I've had 4 years to work out what I am next to that, and I've stopped trying to be equal to it. He looked at her. Yes to all 3. I'd have said yes to 9, and I'd like it minuted because I'm a surveyor and I don't trust anything that isn't written down. She laughed and it came out wrong, and she put her hand over her face. That's the worst proposal acceptance in Scotland. It's the only one I've got, he said. You'll notice a lot of that on this coast. They married in the Kirkhaven Kirk in the June, and Angus Bell gave her away at 75 with his hat crushed in his hand, the entire service, and Effie Gillen made the cake, and Enid Sowerby sat in the front pew and cried without making any noise at all, and would not admit to it afterwards. Bracken lived to 11. He was gray to the shoulders by then, and the bad leg had taken the other hip with it, and he had not gone down the track in 2 years and would still not walk past the place on the shore road, and he slept every night on the flags by the great hearth in the round room of the tower. He died in the November of the 5th year in front of that fire with Bee's hand on his ribs, feeling them go up and down the way she had in the dark 3 days before a hearing. She buried him on the north side of the tower in the exact 3 feet of ground he had dug at every day through in October when she had 9 shillings and no idea what she was standing on. She put no stone there for 11 years. Then she put a small one with nothing on it but the date because everyone who mattered already knew. Callum asked her once, quite late, whether she'd have found the chamber without him. Bee thought about it honestly the way she thought about everything. I'd have found the 4 feet, she said. The measuring was mine, but I'd never have known there was anything in a floor niche under 6 inches of straw, and I'd have crawled out of that wall with a wooden bird and nothing else, and I'd have believed the chest was the whole of it. She was quiet a moment. He didn't find it because he was clever. He found it because he wouldn't stop, and he wouldn't stop because Rupert was going to have him shot on a Thursday, and I carried him out of that yard instead. That's the whole chain. Every single thing that happened up here happened because I refused to leave behind the one thing they'd told me was worthless. The light went up on the tower head every night for the rest of her life. It was in the servitude paragraph 3 in her own hand, £1 a year, in the keeping of it belonging to whoever lived at Corby Craig, and the trust paid for the oil until 1889, and the parish paid for it after that, and Bee kept it herself for 31 years, and her daughter kept it for 40 more. The fishermen navigated by it. That was not sentiment. The pilotage notes for that coast list it from 1878 onwards as a fixed white light on the headland, and there are 4 wrecks in the Kirkhaven register before it and none after. On the mantelpiece of the round room, she kept 3 things, and she never once moved them, and they are there still. The heavy rusted iron key to a walled garden at a house that was sold in 1807, and that she never entered again after the age of 25. Isabel Craig's wooden seabird worn smooth down. One whole side by 60 years of a widow's thumb waiting for a man who drowned off the Mull in February 1808, and a school slate cracked across one corner with a sum on it in charcoal that Beer Ross set with a coat of varnish in 1880, so it would never rub out 162 feet round 39 feet across 6 feet 3 of wall and 2 feet 2 of doorway underlined twice, 4 feet unaccounted for. She was asked about that slate more than any other object in the house, and she gave the same answer for 50 years to journalists and to school children and to a royal commission on the notarial registers in 1891. That is not luck, she would say. That is a sum. Anybody in this room could have done it. It wanted no cleverness at all. It wanted a piece of string an afternoon and the willingness to check a thing that everybody else had agreed for 60 years not to look at. They gave her a ruin because they were certain it was worth nothing, and they were certain because not one of them had ever bothered to measure it. Beatrice Craig Ross measured it. She counted 462 instruments on wrapping paper by the light of candles she bought with fish. She walked 11 hours to a courtroom with a barrow and a lame dog and no one beside her, and she stood up in a room where 38 people had looked at the floor and said the true thing out loud and paid for it alone. And because she paid for it first, 9 other people could afford to pay less, and 51 families got their names read back to them across an open table, and 11 houses went up again at Caldham Row. The family that threw her away kept the name and lost the house. She took the pile of stones nobody wanted, and she made it the one light on that whole coast that never went out.